welcome. You've reached a place where history unfolds slowly, one quiet story at a time. So settle into a comfortable position. Dim the lights if you haven't already, and let the distractions of today fade into the background. There's nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do except listen. Together, we'll wander through forgotten civilizations, remarkable journeys, and the everyday lives of people who came long before us. Take a slow, comfortable breath, relax, and let the past gently carry you toward sleep. Tonight, our journey begins in a forest that no longer exists, in a version of Europe so old that the shape of the land itself was different from the one we know now. This was somewhere between 38 and 34 million years ago, in a warm, humid stretch of the world that scientists now place in the region of the modern Baltic Sea. Back then, that area was not open water at all, but a wide, low-lying landscape covered in dense forest, where tall conifer trees grew alongside broadleaf trees in a climate closer to today's subtropics than to the cool, gray Baltic coastlines we picture now. Among those trees were species related to modern pines, and it was these trees, quietly and without any awareness of what they were doing, that began the story of the Amber Road, long before there were any roads, and long before there were any people to walk them. Trees produce resin as a kind of natural defense, a sticky, slow-moving substance that seeps out to seal wounds in the bark, to trap insects that might do harm, and to protect against disease. In most cases, this resin simply hardens, breaks down over time, and disappears back into the soil, leaving no trace behind. But in this particular forest, across a long stretch of geological time, something different happened. The resin flowed in extraordinary quantities, dripping down trunks, pooling in the ground beneath the trees, and eventually being carried by rivers and streams toward a great river delta, where it settled into layers of sand and clay. There, cut off from air and protected from decay, the resin began a transformation that would take millions of years to complete. Slowly, through pressure, through time, and through a natural chemical process, the soft resin hardened into a stable, golden substance. This is amber, and what we are describing is not myth or legend, but a documented geological process, one that left behind one of the richest deposits of fossil resin found anywhere on Earth. Scientists refer to this particular resin as succinite, and the ancient forest that produced it is sometimes called, informally, the Amber Forest, though of course it had no name at the time, since there was no one there yet to give it one. As millions of years passed, the landscape itself changed almost beyond recognition. Sea levels rose and fell, ice ages came and went, and the low, warm forest gradually gave way to the colder, wetter conditions that would eventually define northern Europe. The amber, buried safely within layers of sediment, now known to geologists as blue earth, waited quietly beneath the ground and beneath the sea for a very long time. It is worth pausing here, in this early, patient part of the story, to simply sit with the scale of it. Long before the first humans walked anywhere on Earth, this amber was already old. By the time early humans began to appear across Africa and Eurasia, the amber beneath the Baltic coast had already been resting in the earth for tens of millions of years, undisturbed, unseen, simply existing. There is something quietly calming in that thought, if you allow yourself to sit with it for a moment. Some things in this world move at a pace so slow that our ordinary sense of time barely applies to them at all. A river reshapes its banks over centuries. A forest becomes stone over millions of years. And somewhere beneath a cold, gray sea, drops of ancient tree resin waited patiently to be found, carrying within them, in many cases, the perfectly preserved bodies of insects that had become trapped in the resin while it was still soft and flowing, tiny witnesses to a warm, ancient world that no longer exists anywhere on the surface of the earth. Eventually, humans did arrive in this part of northern Europe, moving north gradually as the great ice sheets retreated at the end of the last ice age, somewhere around 12,000 years ago. These were small groups of hunter-gatherers, following herds of reindeer and other game, fishing along coastlines and rivers, and slowly settling into the rhythms of a landscape that was still recovering from the cold. It was these people, walking along the shifting, sandy coastlines of what we now call the Baltic Sea, who first noticed something unusual lying among the seaweed and driftwood that washed up after storms. Pieces of amber, warmed by sunlight, catching the light in a way that nothing else around them did, smooth to the touch, sometimes containing the delicate shapes of ancient insects suspended inside, as though frozen mid-motion. We cannot know exactly what these early people thought when they first held amber in their hands, since they left us no written words, only objects, bones, and the quiet evidence of the ground itself. But archaeological finds suggest that amber captured their attention almost immediately, and that it held a special place in their lives from a very early point onward. Simple amber pendants and beads, shaped by hand using stone tools, have been found at sites dating back many thousands of years, long before the rise of any of the civilizations we usually associate with the ancient world. This tells us something gentle and important about human nature, something that connects those early Baltic communities directly to us, even across such an enormous distance of time. People have always been drawn to warmth, to light, and to beauty found in unexpected places. A piece of amber, warmed slightly in the palm of a hand, catching sunlight in a soft golden glow, must have felt almost alive to people living in a cold, often gray northern landscape. A small piece of warmth pulled from the sea itself. In this first part of our journey, There is no rush, no destination we need to reach quickly. We are simply resting here on an ancient shoreline, watching early humans bend down to pick up small golden stones from among the tangled seaweed, without yet knowing that these same stones would one day travel across an entire continent, carried by hand, by cart, by river boat, from one community to another, over thousands of years, connecting peoples who would never meet and rarely even hear each other's true names. That is where our story is headed slowly, over many nights if needed, moving south along ancient paths, through river valleys, across mountain passes, and eventually to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. But for tonight, we simply stay here, on this quiet northern coastline, in the soft gray light of a world still recovering from an ice age, watching the tide pull back gently to reveal small pieces of a forest that vanished millions of years before any human eye ever saw it. Let your breathing settle into a slow, easy rhythm, matching, if you like, the quiet pull of the tide along that ancient shore. There is nothing more you need to understand tonight, nothing more you need to hold on to. Simply rest here, on the edge of a cold northern sea, as the story of Amber quietly begins. We remain, for now, on that same northern coastline, though many generations have quietly passed since we first watched people bending down to gather amber from the tide line. The communities living along this coast, in the region we now call the Baltic, had settled into a slower, steadier way of life, one shaped closely by the sea, the forests, and the changing seasons. These were not yet farmers in the way we usually imagine, planting fields and building permanent villages. For a long stretch of time, they lived by fishing, by hunting, by gathering what the land and sea offered, moving in small, familiar patterns between coastal camps and inland shelters, following the rhythms of fish runs, bird migrations, and the changing behavior of the sea itself. Amber gathering fit naturally into this way of life, since it required no special tools, no digging, no long journeys away from the places where people already lived and worked. After storms, when the sea had churned up the sandy bottom near the shore, pieces of amber would often wash up along the beach, sometimes in small quantities, and occasionally, after particularly strong storms, in much larger amounts. People learned to watch the weather closely, understanding that a storm from a certain direction, followed by a period of calm, often meant a good morning for walking the tide line. Some communities also learned to gather amber directly from shallow coastal waters, using simple nets on long poles to scoop up floating pieces. Since amber, being lighter than seawater in many cases, could sometimes be seen drifting gently near the surface, caught in patches of seaweed that had been loosened from the seabed by the churning of a storm. This early relationship with amber was practical, patient, and closely tied to observation of the natural world, rather than anything resembling large-scale trade or industry. Archaeologists studying settlements from this period, dating back many thousands of years, have found amber worked into simple forms: small beads pierced with a narrow hole, pendants shaped roughly like animals, and flat, polished pieces that may have been sewn onto clothing or attached to other objects. The tools used to shape amber were themselves quite simple, made of flint or bone, since amber, while harder than many people assume, can still be worked with patience using stone tools, through careful scraping, grinding, and polishing. We should imagine, then, quiet evenings inside shelters made of wood, hide, and thatched reed, lit by the soft glow of a fire, where someone sits slowly turning a small piece of amber in their hands, working it gradually into a shape meaningful to them. Perhaps a bird, perhaps a simple round bead, perhaps a shape whose meaning has been lost entirely to time. We cannot know with certainty what amber meant symbolically to these early communities, since they left behind no written explanations, only the objects themselves, and the careful way in which those objects were sometimes buried alongside the dead. In a number of ancient burial sites along the Baltic coast and further inland, archaeologists have found amber beads and ornaments placed deliberately with the bodies of the deceased, suggesting that amber carried some kind of significance beyond simple decoration, perhaps tied to warmth, to the sun, or to ideas about protection and continuity that we can only partly guess at now. It is worth noting, gently, that amber was not unique in this regard. Many ancient cultures placed meaningful objects with their dead, a practice that speaks to a very old and very human impulse to care for those we have lost, to send them onward with something valued, something warm, something that perhaps reflected how they themselves had been valued in life. As centuries passed, and as farming slowly spread into this region from further south, communities along the Baltic coast began to settle more permanently, building longer-lasting homes, keeping livestock, and cultivating small fields alongside their continued fishing and gathering. Even as life changed in these ways, amber gathering continued largely unchanged. A quiet, steady practice passed down from one generation to the next, requiring only patience and a close familiarity with the sea. It was around this time, roughly during the later Neolithic period and into the early Bronze Age, that something new began to happen with the amber gathered along these shores. Rather than staying entirely within local communities, worked only for local use, small quantities of amber began to move. At first, this movement was almost certainly informal. Amber passed from one family to a neighboring family, from one small settlement to another slightly further inland, exchanged for other goods, or given as gifts to mark alliances, marriages, or visits between communities that otherwise had little regular contact. This is how nearly all long-distance trade begins in the ancient world, not as an organized system with maps and merchants, but as a quiet chain of small, local exchanges, each one modest in itself, yet capable, over time and distance, of carrying an object remarkably far from where it began. A piece of amber gathered on a Baltic beach might pass through the hands of perhaps a dozen or more people before it ever reached anyone who had traveled more than a short distance from home, each exchange moving it a little further south, a little further from the sea that had shaped it. We can picture this quiet chain almost like a slow-moving current, invisible to anyone living within it, yet gradually pulling small golden stones away from the coast and toward the heart of the European continent. There was no single moment when this became a deliberate trade route, no single decision made by any one person or community. Instead, over a period of many generations, informal exchange slowly hardened, much like the resin itself once had, into something more consistent, more expected, and eventually into something that later peoples and later historians would come to recognize as a genuine trade network, one that we now call, in a broad and somewhat simplified way, the Amber Road. Before we continue further along that road ourselves, it is worth resting a little longer here, along this quiet northern coastline, considering the lives of the people who first gathered these small golden stones. Their names are entirely lost to us. We do not know what language they spoke, what stories they told each other around their fires, or what they believed happened to a person after death. And yet, through the careful, patient work of archaeologists, and through the simple, enduring objects they left behind, we know that they noticed beauty in the natural world around them. We know that they valued warmth and light and the particular golden glow of sunlight caught inside a small stone. We know that they cared enough about these objects to shape them by hand over long, quiet hours, and to place them gently beside their loved ones when those loved ones died. There is something deeply calming in recognizing how far back these simple human instincts reach, long before cities, long before written history, long before any of the grand civilizations we usually think of as the beginning of the ancient world. If you find your thoughts growing quieter now, that is exactly as it should be. We will continue moving south soon, following amber inland along ancient rivers. But there is no need to hurry. Let your breathing slow further and rest for a while longer on this calm, ancient shore where the tide continues its quiet, endless rhythm, exactly as it did then, and exactly as it does now. From the quiet shores of the Baltic, our journey now turns gently inland, following the slow pull of rivers that carried both water and, in time, small quantities of amber, away from the coast and toward the heart of the European continent. Two rivers in particular played a central role in this early southward movement, the Vistula and the Oder, both of which begin far inland in what is now southern Poland and the northern edges of the Czech lands, before winding their way north to empty into the Baltic Sea. For the communities of the Bronze Age, roughly between 4,000 and 3,000 years ago, rivers such as these were not simply geographic features, but genuine highways, offering a far easier way to move both people and goods than traveling overland through dense forest and uneven terrain. A small boat, or even a raft, could carry goods along a river far more efficiently than someone walking on foot. And settlements naturally tended to cluster along riverbanks, creating a loose but steady chain of communities connected by the water flowing past their homes. It was along these river corridors that amber began its slow, steady movement south, passing from settlement to settlement in a manner not unlike the informal exchanges we described along the coast itself, only now carried further and increasingly exchanged for goods that the northern communities did not have easy access to on their own. This is an important point to sit with for a moment, since it explains why amber trade grew steadily over time, rather than remaining a purely local curiosity. The Baltic region was rich in amber, but relatively poor in metal ores, particularly copper and tin, both of which were essential for producing bronze, the defining material of this entire era. Further south and east, in regions including parts of the Carpathian Mountains and areas extending toward the Alps, communities had access to these metals, but not to amber. A natural exchange developed, gradual and informal at first, in which amber moved south, and in return, finished bronze tools, weapons, and ornaments, or sometimes the raw materials themselves, moved north. This kind of exchange, where two regions each hold something the other lacks, has formed the basis of long-distance trade throughout much of human history. And the Amber Road, in this sense, was simply one of the earliest clear examples of this pattern taking shape across the European continent. Archaeologists studying settlements along the Vistula River Valley have found amber beads and ornaments at sites well inland from the coast, evidence that amber was moving steadily south during this period, gradually appearing further and further from its point of origin as centuries passed. Alongside amber, other goods moved as well, including finely worked bronze items, pottery styles that show clear connections between distant regions, and occasionally more unusual objects that hint at contact, stretching even further afield than we might initially expect. It's worth remembering, as we follow this quiet southward current, that no single person during this era ever traveled the entire length of what we now call the Amber Road. There was no merchant who set out from the Baltic coast with a wagon full of amber, intending to reach the Mediterranean Sea in one long journey. Instead, amber moved through what researchers often describe as a relay system, passing through the hands of many different communities, each one responsible only for a relatively short stretch of the journey, trading with neighboring groups slightly further south. who would then trade it onward again in turn. In this way, a single piece of amber might take not weeks, but years, or even generations, to travel the full distance from the Baltic coast to communities living near the Alps or beyond, changing hands many times along the way, each exchange adding a small piece to a much larger, largely invisible network that no single participant fully understood or controlled. This slow, layered process makes the Amber Road quite different from later, more centralized trade routes, such as those that would eventually be organized under the authority of the Roman Empire. In the Bronze Age, the Amber Road was less a fixed path marked on any kind of map, and more a general direction of movement. A broad southward drift of goods flowing gradually through a landscape of scattered farming communities, river settlements, and increasingly fortified hilltop sites that served as local centers of trade and craft production. One such culture, known to modern archaeologists as the Unetis culture, flourished in this region during the early Bronze Age, in areas that now correspond roughly to parts of the modern Czech Republic, southern Poland, and eastern Germany. Communities within this culture are known for their skilled bronze working, and amber has been found at a number of Unetis sites, further confirming that this region served as an important stage along the broader southward movement of amber from the Baltic. Slightly later, in the Middle and Late Bronze Age, another cultural tradition known as the Lusatian culture became prominent across parts of this same general region, and amber continued to appear at settlement and burial sites associated with these communities as well, suggesting a long continuity in this pattern of exchange, stretching across many centuries. It is easy, when thinking about ancient trade routes, to imagine grand caravans and dramatic journeys. But the reality along these early stretches of the Amber Road was almost certainly far quieter and far more embedded in ordinary daily life than that. A farmer traveling a short distance to a neighboring settlement to trade grain or livestock might also carry with them a handful of amber beads, received perhaps from a relative further north, intending to exchange them for a bronze tool or a piece of pottery. A local craftsperson, skilled in working both metal and stone, might occasionally receive amber as part of a broader exchange, working it into new forms before it continued its journey onward in someone else's hands. There is a gentle, almost domestic quality to this early stage of the Amber Road, one shaped not by grand ambition, but by the ordinary human desire to have access to useful and beautiful things that were not available close to home. As we continue to follow this river-based path further south in the nights ahead, we will begin to see amber moving through regions with denser populations, more organized settlements, and eventually more formal trade connections stretching toward the Alps and beyond. But for now, it is enough simply to rest here, In this middle stretch of the journey, imagining slow river currents carrying small boats between quiet settlements, amber passing gently from hand to hand, following the same unhurried rhythm that has carried our own thoughts through this evening. Let your breathing continue at its own easy pace, neither rushed nor forced. Much like the slow, patient flow of the rivers we have been following tonight, there is nothing more required of you now than simply resting here, somewhere along an ancient river valley, as amber continues its long, quiet journey south, as centuries continued to pass, and as the slow, steady flow of amber carried it further from its northern origins, it eventually reached a region that would come to serve as one of the most important crossing points along the entire route, a natural corridor of land known today as the Moravian Gate. This is a low, relatively gentle stretch of terrain, situated between the Sudeten Mountains to the west and the Carpathian Mountains to the east, forming a kind of natural gap through an otherwise more difficult mountainous landscape. For anyone traveling by land between the Baltic region and the lands further south, toward the Danube River, and eventually the Alps, this gap offered a far easier path than attempting to cross the mountains directly. And it is no surprise that it became, over time, one of the most consistently used corridors along the broader amber trade network. We should picture this region not as a single road in the modern sense, marked clearly and maintained by any central authority, but rather as a general zone of movement, a landscape shaped gradually by centuries of repeated travel, where certain paths, river crossings, and valley routes became worn and familiar through steady, ongoing use. Communities living within and near the Moravian Gate would have grown accustomed to a slow but fairly regular passage of goods, and people moving both north and south. And it is likely that certain settlements in this region developed a particular importance as gathering points, where goods arriving from different directions could be exchanged before continuing onward. By the later Bronze Age and into the early Iron Age, roughly between 1,000 and 500 years before the Common Era, the peoples of Central Europe had developed increasingly complex societies, marked by more organized settlements, skilled craft production, and clearer social distinctions between different groups within these communities. Among the most notable of these later Iron Age cultures were the Celtic peoples, whose influence eventually spread across a very wide stretch of Central and Western Europe, and whose presence is closely tied to this middle portion of the Amber Road. Celtic communities were skilled metalworkers, and evidence of amber has been found at a number of Celtic settlement sites, often alongside finely crafted bronze and iron objects, suggesting that amber continued to hold value as both a decorative material and, quite likely, as an item carrying particular social or symbolic significance among these later Iron Age societies. One especially interesting feature of this period is the development of hill forts, fortified settlements built on elevated, defensible ground, which became increasingly common across Central Europe during the Iron Age. These hill forts often served not only as places of shelter and defense, but also as important centers of trade and craft production. And it is within and around several of these sites that archaeologists have discovered notable quantities of worked amber, further confirming their role as key points along the broader trade network, moving goods between northern and southern Europe. It is worth pausing here to consider just how interconnected this world had become by this stage of our journey. Even without any of the infrastructure we typically associate with organized long-distance trade in later periods of history. There were no formal roads paved with stone, no organized systems of currency in the way we understand money today, and no central authority overseeing or regulating this movement of goods. And yet, amber originating from a coastline many hundreds of kilometers to the north continued to move steadily southward, alongside other valuable materials such as salt, copper, tin, and finely crafted metal goods, creating a web of exchange that connected communities across a truly vast stretch of the European continent. This connection was not limited to material goods alone. Alongside amber and metal objects, ideas, artistic styles, and technological knowledge also traveled along these same general routes, carried by the same slow, patient process of exchange between neighboring communities. Certain decorative patterns and craft techniques appear with variations across a wide geographic area during this period, suggesting that communities along the Amber Road were aware of and influenced by developments occurring in distant regions they themselves had likely never visited directly. This is one of the quieter, more thoughtful aspects of studying ancient trade routes such as this one. We often think of history in terms of great individual figures, kings, conquerors, and famous names recorded in later written accounts. But the Amber Road, at least during this earlier stage of its long history, tells a different kind of story. One built not around any single person or event, but around countless small, ordinary exchanges, repeated patiently across many generations, gradually weaving together a continent that might otherwise have remained far more isolated, region from region, community from community. As we continue moving south through Central Europe in the nights ahead, we will begin to approach a genuinely dramatic feature of the landscape, the Alps themselves, and we will see how these mountains, rather than blocking the Amber Road entirely, instead shaped and directed its path through a series of specific, well-used mountain passes. But for tonight, it is enough to rest here a little longer, somewhere within this quiet, interconnected landscape of Central Europe, imagining small settlements nestled along river valleys and hill forts, each one playing its own small part in a much larger, unspoken network stretching from a cold northern sea toward the warmer waters of the Mediterranean. Allow your body to feel heavier now, sinking gently into whatever is supporting you, much like the way small, ordinary exchanges settled gradually over centuries into the deep, enduring pattern we now call the Amber Road. There is nothing further you need to follow closely tonight. Simply rest here at this quiet central crossroads as our slow journey south continues. From the rolling landscape of Central Europe, our journey now turns toward a far more dramatic feature of the continent, the great arc of mountains known as the Alps, stretching in a wide curve across what is now southern Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and northern Italy. For the communities moving amber southward during the Bronze and Iron Ages, the Alps presented a genuine obstacle, far more significant than anything encountered earlier in the journey. These are not gentle hills that can simply be walked over without much thought, but a vast, often harsh landscape of steep valleys, high ridgelines, and passes that could become dangerous or entirely impassable depending on the season and the weather. And yet, rather than stopping the movement of amber and other goods entirely, the Alps instead shaped and concentrated that movement into a smaller number of specific, well-known routes, certain valleys, and mountain passes that offered a manageable, if still demanding, way through. One of the most historically significant regions along this stretch of the journey lies in what is now Austria, particularly around the area near modern Hallstatt, a place that has given its name to an entire archaeological period, the Hallstatt culture, which flourished during the early Iron Age, roughly between 800 and 400 years before the Common Era. Hallstatt itself sits in a strikingly beautiful alpine setting along the shore of a mountain lake, surrounded by steep, forested slopes. What made this particular location so important, however, was not primarily its scenery, but something found deep within the mountains nearby: vast deposits of salt. Salt, much like amber, was an extremely valuable commodity in the ancient world, essential for preserving food, and difficult to obtain in many inland regions. The people of Hallstatt developed sophisticated techniques for mining this salt from deep underground, and the wealth generated by this salt trade helped support a remarkably rich and well-organized society, one whose burial sites have yielded a wide range of finely crafted goods, including, notably, worked amber, brought from the north along the very trade routes we have been following throughout this journey. It is worth sitting with this connection for a moment, since it illustrates something important about how ancient trade networks actually functioned. The Amber Road was never a single, isolated route carrying only one type of good in one direction. Instead, it overlapped and intertwined with other trade networks, such as the salt trade centered around places like Hallstatt, creating a broader, layered system of exchange. in which different valuable materials moved along shared or connected paths, mutually reinforcing the importance of certain key locations along the way. Communities positioned at these overlapping points, such as those near Hallstatt, often grew notably wealthier and more socially complex than settlements located along less significant stretches of the broader network, precisely because they benefited from multiple streams of valuable trade passing through or near their territory. As amber moved further into and eventually through the Alps, it would have passed along specific mountain routes that had become established over generations as the most practical paths through this challenging terrain. Certain valleys, such as those associated with the Brenner Pass, connecting the region of modern South Tyrol between Austria and Italy, offered a relatively lower and more manageable crossing point compared to the higher, more treacherous routes found elsewhere along the mountain range. Travelers moving amber and other goods through these passes would have needed to contend with real physical challenges. Cold temperatures, even in relatively mild seasons, the risk of sudden weather changes, and simply the demanding nature of traveling on foot or with pack animals through steep, uneven terrain. We do not know the names of any specific individuals who made these particular crossings during the Bronze and Early Iron Age, since, as we noted earlier in our journey, this movement of goods took place gradually, through many hands, rather than through single long-distance expeditions undertaken by identifiable individuals. And yet, it is worth imagining, gently and without dramatization, what such a crossing might have involved. Small groups moving carefully along familiar mountain paths, carrying amber, salt, and other valuable goods in simple packs, or on the backs of pack animals, moving at a slow, careful pace suited to the difficulty of the terrain, likely timing their journeys to avoid the harshest periods of winter weather. The presence of amber found at various alpine and subalpine archaeological sites confirms that these crossings did indeed take place with some regularity over an extended period of time, gradually connecting the world of Northern and Central Europe with the world that lay just beyond the southern edge of the mountains, a world that opened out into the warmer river valleys and coastal plains of northern Italy. As we approach the far side of the Alps together, it is worth taking a moment to notice how far we have already traveled in our imagination this evening, from a cold northern seashore, along winding rivers, across the rolling landscape of Central Europe, and now, finally, through a great mountain range that once seemed, to the people crossing it, like one of the more formidable challenges of their entire journey. There is no need to rush through this final stretch of mountain landscape tonight. We can simply rest here for a while, somewhere among these ancient peaks and valleys, imagining the quiet, steady effort of those long-ago travelers, carrying small, valuable objects carefully through difficult terrain, trusting in paths worn smooth by those who had come before them. Let your breathing settle further, slow and even, matching the patient, careful pace of a mountain crossing made not in haste, but with quiet determination and care. Soon, in the segments ahead, we will begin to descend from these mountains together toward the warmer shores of the Adriatic Sea. But for now, there is nothing more required of you than rest. As we descend from the southern edge of the Alps together, the landscape around us begins to change quite noticeably, opening out into wider valleys, gentler hills, and eventually the broad, fertile plains of northern Italy. The air here would have felt different too, milder and warmer than the alpine passes we have just left behind, carrying with it the particular quality of light and climate found near the northern shores of the Adriatic Sea. It is here, in this region, that our journey brings us to one of the most important and well-documented destinations along the entire length of the Amber Road, a place that would eventually become known, especially during the later Roman period, as one of the great centers of amber craftsmanship in the ancient world, the city of Aquileia. Before Aquileia rose to prominence as a Roman city, however, this general region was already home to established communities engaged in trade and craft, including the Veneti, an ancient people who lived in the area corresponding roughly to modern northeastern Italy. In the centuries leading up to and during the early Roman period, the Veneti developed a notable reputation for working with amber, and archaeological finds from this region confirm that amber arriving from the north, having completed its long journey across rivers through Central Europe and over the Alps, was here transformed by skilled local craftspeople into finished ornaments, beads, and decorative objects. This marks an important shift in the story we have been following together this evening. Until now, we have largely traced the movement of raw or lightly worked amber, passing gradually from community to community, valued for its natural beauty and rarity. Here, in the workshops of the Veneti and later Roman Aquileia, amber increasingly became the raw material for genuine artistic craftsmanship, shaped by skilled hands into far more elaborate and refined forms than had typically been produced in the northern regions where amber originated. Aquileia itself, founded as a Roman colony in the early 2nd century before the Common Era, grew steadily over time into a significant and prosperous city, benefiting enormously from its position near the northern end of the Adriatic Sea and from its role as a key terminus for goods arriving via the Amber Road. By the time of the early Roman Empire, Aquileia had become widely recognized as one of the most important centers of amber working anywhere in the ancient world, home to skilled artisans who produced an extraordinary range of amber objects, including finely carved figures, decorative panels, jewelry, and small, delicately worked personal items. The wealth generated by this amber trade and craftsmanship contributed significantly to the broader prosperity of the city. And Aquileia would go on to become one of the largest and most important urban centers in northern Italy during the height of the Roman period, a status closely tied, at least in part, to its long-standing connection with the amber trade flowing down from the north. It is worth taking a moment here to consider the geography that made this location so consistently important across many centuries. From the pre-Roman Veneti period through to the height of Roman power, Aquileia sat near the point where several important routes converged. The mountain passes bringing goods down from the Alps, river systems connecting the surrounding region, and importantly, direct access to the Adriatic Sea itself, allowing goods, including finished amber objects, to be shipped further afield to other parts of the growing Mediterranean world. In this way, Aquileia functioned as a genuine hinge point along our journey, the place where the slow, overland movement of raw amber, carried gradually south over many centuries through the hands of countless unnamed traders and travelers, finally met the wider, interconnected maritime world of the Mediterranean, a world of established sea routes, port cities, and increasingly organized long-distance trade. We should also pause to appreciate the skill involved in the amber craftsmanship that flourished in this region. Working amber requires considerable patience and care, since the material, while beautiful, can be brittle and must be handled thoughtfully to avoid cracking during carving and polishing. Craftspeople in this region developed refined techniques for shaping amber into detailed figural pieces, sometimes depicting animals, human figures, or scenes drawn from mythology, as well as more practical items such as amber-handled tools, hairpins, and small containers. These finished pieces were highly valued, not only within the local region, but increasingly among wealthier communities across the broader Mediterranean world. As amber's reputation as a rare and beautiful material continued to spread alongside the physical objects themselves. As we rest here for a while, on the northern shores of the Adriatic, it is worth reflecting gently on just how much distance and how much time separates this moment in our journey from where we began. We started on a cold northern coastline, watching early hunter-gatherers pick up small, sun-warmed stones from among the seaweed, with no sense whatsoever of trade routes, distant cities, or skilled workshops. Now we find ourselves in a warmer, sunnier landscape, watching skilled artisans carefully shape that same material into refined works of art, destined for wealthy households across an entire ancient world. And yet, the connection between these two moments, separated by so many centuries and so many hundreds of kilometers, remains unbroken, carried forward patiently through countless small exchanges, each one a quiet link in an extraordinarily long chain. In the segments ahead, we will continue exploring this Mediterranean world, moving from the northern Adriatic further into the heart of ancient Italy, and eventually toward the world of ancient Greece, where amber took on yet another layer of meaning, wrapped in myth and legend. But for tonight, there is no need to hurry onward. Let yourself rest here a little longer. In this warm, coastal landscape, imagining the quiet, careful work of ancient artisans, shaping small pieces of ancient sunlight into lasting forms of beauty. From the northern Adriatic, our journey now turns gently toward another region of ancient Italy, one whose civilization flourished in the centuries before Rome grew into the dominant power of the peninsula, the world of the Etruscans. The Etruscan civilization developed across a broad region of central Italy, roughly corresponding to modern Tuscany, western Umbria, and parts of Lazio. Reaching a particular height of wealth, artistic achievement, and regional influence between approximately the 8th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era. The Etruscans were skilled traders, connected through both land and sea routes to a wide network of neighboring cultures, including the Greeks to the south and east, and the peoples of Central and Northern Europe, from whom amber continued to arrive. Following paths that connected, directly or indirectly, to the broader amber road we have been tracing throughout this journey. Etruscan society placed considerable value on finely crafted luxury goods, and amber fit naturally into this appreciation, valued both for its natural beauty and for the skill required to shape it into refined decorative and personal items. Archaeologists have uncovered a remarkable quantity of worked amber within Etruscan tombs, a discovery that tells us a great deal, both about the value placed on amber within this society and about Etruscan burial customs more broadly. Much like the early Baltic communities we encountered near the very beginning of our journey this evening, the Etruscans often placed meaningful, valuable objects alongside their dead, reflecting a belief common across many ancient cultures that such objects held significance extending beyond the practical concerns of everyday life. The amber objects found within Etruscan tombs are often strikingly detailed, carved into forms such as reclining figures, animals, and small decorative pendants, sometimes combined with other precious materials such as gold, in finely balanced compositions that reflect a genuinely sophisticated level of craftsmanship. One recurring theme found in Etruscan amber carving involves depictions of pairs of figures, sometimes interpreted as representing particular mythological subjects, reclining together in a manner that suggests these pieces may have held personal or symbolic meaning related to companionship, protection, or perhaps ideas connected to the afterlife. Themes that appear repeatedly across Etruscan funerary art more broadly. It's worth noting, gently, that much of what we understand about Etruscan beliefs and mythology comes to us indirectly, since relatively little Etruscan writing has survived in a form that allows for full and confident translation. Unlike the far more extensive written records left behind by their Greek and later Roman neighbors, this means that many interpretations of Etruscan amber artwork, including the meanings behind specific figures or scenes, remain informed guesses based on careful comparison with related imagery from Greek mythology and art, rather than something we can state with complete certainty. Even with this uncertainty, the physical evidence itself, the amber objects preserved so carefully within Etruscan tombs for well over 2,000 years, speaks clearly to the value and meaning this material held within Etruscan society. The presence of such richly worked amber pieces also tells us something important about the broader trade connections of the Etruscan world during this period. For amber to arrive in such quantities, and for local craftspeople to develop such refined skill in working it, there must have been a fairly steady and reliable supply reaching this region, arriving through a combination of overland routes connecting to the broader Central European trade network, and quite possibly through maritime routes along the Adriatic and Tyrrhenian coasts as well, linking Etruscan territory to other trading communities across the wider Mediterranean world. The Etruscans, in this sense, occupied an important position within the broader story of the Amber Road, not as the origin point of the material itself, which remained firmly in the north, but as one of several key centers where that material was transformed through skilled craftsmanship into objects of genuine artistic and cultural significance within the Mediterranean world. As Etruscan civilization gradually declined in political power during the later centuries before the Common Era, giving way increasingly to the rising influence of Rome, much of Etruscan artistic tradition, including techniques and stylistic influences related to amber working, did not simply disappear, but instead influenced and blended into the artistic traditions of the Roman world that followed. This pattern of skills, materials, and artistic traditions flowing forward across changing political circumstances is a recurring theme throughout the broader history we have been exploring this evening. Trade routes and the craftsmanship connected to them often prove remarkably resilient, continuing to function and adapt even as the particular civilizations controlling or benefiting from them rise, and eventually give way to others. As we rest here for a while, among the quiet, carefully preserved treasures of Etruscan tombs, it is worth considering how much care and attention these ancient people placed on the objects they chose to keep close to them, even in death. A small piece of amber, carved carefully into the shape of a reclining figure, placed gently within a tomb alongside its owner, represents not only fine craftsmanship, but also a very old and very human wish to hold onto something warm, something beautiful, even as one moves from the world of the living into whatever lay beyond it, according to Etruscan belief. In the segment ahead, we will move further south still, into the world of ancient Greece, where amber became woven into myth and story in a way that adds yet another dimension to the material's long and quiet history. But for now, allow yourself simply to rest here, surrounded by the soft, warm glow of ancient amber carvings, resting undisturbed for thousands of years within the quiet stillness of Etruscan tombs. Our journey now carries us further into the ancient Mediterranean world, toward ancient Greece, a civilization whose writers and poets left behind an extraordinarily rich body of literature, much of it still read and studied today. Thousands of years later, it is within this Greek world that amber acquired something it had not quite possessed before in our journey this evening. A formal place within recorded mythology, carefully written down and passed on through generations of storytelling. Before turning to myth, however, it is worth noting that amber had already been present in the Greek world for a considerable time before these stories were ever written down. Archaeologists have discovered amber objects within Mycenaean Greek burial sites, including the famous shaft graves at Mycenae itself, dating back to the 2nd millennium before the Common Era. Evidence that amber had already reached the Greek mainland during the Bronze Age, carried along trade connections that, directly or indirectly, linked back to the same broad network we have been following throughout tonight's journey. This early presence of amber within elite Mycenaean burials suggests that, much like in the Baltic, Bronze Age Central Europe, and later Etruscan Italy, amber was regarded in early Greece as a rare and valuable material, fitting for inclusion among the possessions of the wealthy and powerful. It was in later Greek literature, however, that amber found its most enduring and poetic association through the myth of Phaethon, a story recorded by several ancient writers, including, in its most famous surviving version, the Roman poet Ovid, writing considerably later, though drawing on much older Greek storytelling traditions. The myth tells of Phaethon, a young man said to be the son of Helios, the god who drove the chariot of the sun across the sky each day, wishing to prove his divine parentage. Phaethon persuaded his father to allow him to drive the sun chariot for a single day. Unable to control the powerful horses that pulled it, Phaethon lost his way across the sky, and in the resulting chaos, the world below suffered greatly from the chariot's uneven, uncontrolled path, at times flying too close to the earth, at other times too far away. To prevent further disaster, in most versions of the story, Zeus struck Phaethon down with a thunderbolt, and the young man fell from the sky into a great river, identified in the myth as the Eridanos, a river whose exact real-world location remains uncertain and much debated among scholars, sometimes associated loosely with rivers in northern Italy, including the Po. Phaethon's sisters, known as the Heliades, daughters of Helios, mourned their brother's death so deeply and for so long that the gods, moved by their grief, transformed them into poplar trees standing along the riverbank where Phaethon had fallen. According to the myth, the tears these transformed sisters continued to shed for their lost brother hardened, upon contact with the air, into amber, which then fell into the river and was carried along its waters. This is, of course, a myth, a piece of ancient storytelling rather than a literal historical or scientific explanation, and it should be understood and presented as such. And yet, myths such as this one tell us something genuinely meaningful about how ancient peoples understood and made sense of the natural world around them, including materials like amber, whose true origin, a slow geological process involving ancient tree resin hardening over millions of years, was entirely unknown and unknowable to them at the time. Faced with a warm, golden material that seemed to hold within it, quite literally in many cases, a hint of something once alive, insects perfectly preserved inside, ancient peoples across many cultures reached naturally toward stories of transformation, of grief becoming beauty, of loss becoming something lasting and precious. It is worth noting that this particular association between amber and sorrowful tears was not limited only to the myth of Phaethon. Various ancient writers, drawing on this general poetic tradition, referred to amber more broadly in connection with weeping, tears, and mourning, embedding this golden material deeply within the emotional and symbolic language of ancient Mediterranean literature and culture. The Greek word most closely associated with amber, electron, is itself worth pausing on for a moment, since it carries an interesting legacy of its own. This word referred both to amber and, at times, to a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver that shared amber's pale, luminous quality. Centuries later, this same Greek word would eventually give rise to the modern English word electricity, since amber, when rubbed with cloth, was observed by ancient Greek writers, including Thales of Miletus, to attract small, lightweight objects, an early and genuinely important observation of what we now understand as static electricity. Though the underlying scientific explanation for this phenomenon would not be properly understood for many centuries afterward, there's something quietly remarkable in recognizing that a single ancient material, gathered originally from a cold northern shoreline by people whose names we will never know, eventually became woven into Greek mythology, embedded within the very language later cultures would use to describe an entirely new area of scientific understanding. One that would, many centuries later, transform the modern world in ways those ancient Greek observers could never have imagined. As we rest here for a while, among these old stories of grieving sisters and falling sunlight, it is worth simply appreciating the way that human beings, across so many different cultures and so many centuries, have consistently reached for story and meaning when faced with the quiet mysteries of the natural world. Amber, warm and golden, catching the light in a way unlike almost anything else found in nature, seemed, to the ancient Greek imagination, like something that could only have come from grief transformed. Tears turned lasting and beautiful. We know now, of course, a different and equally remarkable story, one of ancient forests and slow geological time, which we explored together at the very beginning of this journey. Perhaps there is room, gently, for both stories to sit alongside each other in our minds tonight. One rooted in careful scientific understanding, the other in the old, patient human tradition of turning mystery into myth. In the segment ahead, we will move fully into the world of Rome, where amber reached perhaps its greatest height of popularity and formal, organized trade across the ancient world. But for now, let yourself rest quietly among these old Greek stories, imagining slow rivers, weeping poplar trees, and small golden tears drifting gently downstream. Our journey now brings us to the height of the ancient amber trade, a period during which the routes we have been following all evening, slowly, gradually, across so many centuries, became more organized, more heavily traveled, and considerably better documented than at any earlier point in this long story. The era of the Roman Empire. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Rome had grown into the dominant power across the entire Mediterranean world, and its vast, interconnected system of roads, administration, and trade networks brought a new level of structure to routes that had previously developed only gradually and informally over many generations through countless small local exchanges. The Amber Road benefited significantly from this broader Roman infrastructure, and demand for amber among wealthy Romans grew considerably during this period, driven by fashion, by amber's continued association with rarity and luxury, and by its long-standing reputation, inherited from earlier Greek tradition, as a materia connected to warmth, light, and even certain believed protective or medicinal properties. We are fortunate, in this particular period of our journey, to have access to a genuinely valuable written source, the work of the Roman writer Pliny the Elder, whose extensive encyclopedia, known as the Natural History, completed in the 1st century of the Common Era, includes a detailed discussion of amber, its origins, its trade, and its various uses within Roman society. Pliny's account is particularly valuable to us this evening because it represents one of the earliest surviving attempts by an ancient writer to describe, in careful detail, both the mythological explanations for amber's origin that we explored in the previous segment, and a more grounded physical description of amber as a substance gathered from trees, closer, in some respects, to the scientific understanding we now hold today. Among the most interesting details preserved in Pliny's account is a description of an expedition sent during the reign of the Emperor Nero, specifically to travel north and secure a substantial supply of amber directly from its source, rather than relying solely on the slower, indirect trade routes that had traditionally carried it southward. According to Pliny, a Roman equestrian was dispatched northward for this specific purpose, reaching the Baltic coast, the amber-gathering shores where our own journey began this evening, and returning with an especially large quantity of amber, which was then used, among other things, to help decorate a lavish gladiatorial spectacle held in Rome, an event Pliny describes as being remarkably rich in the decorative use of amber, down to details such as amber-adorned nets used within the arena itself. We should note, gently, that this account, like many details preserved from the ancient world, was written by Pliny based on reports rather than his own direct experience of the journey itself, and some specifics should be treated with appropriate historical caution. Though the broader claim that direct Roman contact with the Baltic amber source region occurred during this period is generally considered plausible and consistent with archaeological evidence from the era. What this account tells us, regardless of its precise details, is that by the height of the Roman Empire, the Amber Road was no longer simply an informal network of gradual, hand-to-hand trade stretching across many small communities, as it had largely been during the Bronze and early Iron Ages we explored earlier this evening. Instead, amber had become important enough, and Roman infrastructure organized enough, that a direct, purposeful expedition to its northern source was considered worthwhile. A level of intentional, long-distance travel that would have been far less feasible in earlier centuries. Roman roads, many of which were built to a remarkably high standard, with carefully constructed surfaces and consistent maintenance, made overland travel considerably faster and more reliable than it had been in earlier periods. And this infrastructure extended usefully into regions relevant to the amber trade, including areas of Central Europe that had, in earlier centuries, relied entirely on the slower, informal paths we described in previous segments of this journey. Amber during the Roman period was used for an impressively wide range of purposes, extending well beyond simple jewelry and decorative carvings, though these remained popular as well. Roman writers, including Pliny, describe amber being valued for small handheld pieces that some Romans reportedly carried simply to enjoy the sensation of warming it gently in the hand. And amber was also believed, in the medical understanding of the time, to hold various protective or healing properties, reflecting broader Roman traditions around natural materials and their believed effects on health, traditions we would today understand quite differently through the lens of modern medicine. Though the sincerity and cultural significance of these ancient beliefs remains a genuine and important part of the historical record, the scale of amber use during this period was substantial enough that Aquileia, which we visited earlier in our journey this evening, grew into an even more significant center of amber craftsmanship under Roman rule, its workshops supplying finished amber goods not only to Rome itself, but to wealthy households across a wide stretch of the broader Roman world, from Britain in the northwest to parts of the eastern Mediterranean. It is worth taking a moment as we rest here within this bustling, interconnected Roman world to reflect on just how far amber and the broader trade network built gradually around it had come since the earliest, quiet exchanges we imagined together at the very beginning of tonight's journey. What began as small pieces of fossilized resin, gathered patiently by hunter-gatherers along a cold northern shoreline, had become, by the height of Roman power, a material significant enough to warrant a formal expedition sponsored by an emperor, crafted by skilled artisans in prosperous Mediterranean workshops, and worn, carried, and valued by people across an extraordinary stretch of the ancient world, from the shores of the Baltic Sea to the streets of Rome itself. And yet, even at this height of organization and formal trade, the underlying rhythm of the Amber Road, patient, gradual, built upon countless individual human connections stretched across a very long distance, remained, in its own way, largely unchanged from the earliest days we explored together this evening. In the final segment of our journey tonight, we will consider what eventually happened to this long, remarkable trade route, as the Roman world itself gradually changed, and as Amber's story continued quietly onward into later centuries, closer to our own time. But for now, let yourself rest here a little longer, within this rich, golden height of the ancient amber trade, imagining bustling workshops, well-maintained roads, and small pieces of ancient sunlight carried carefully across an entire continent, valued now by an empire that had grown to encompass much of the known world. As our journey tonight moves toward its final stretch, it is worth remembering that no trade route, however long-lasting, continues forever in exactly the same form. The Roman Empire itself, whose organized roads and administration had done so much to formalize and expand the amber trade during the centuries we explored in our previous segment, gradually experienced significant change during the later centuries of the first millennium of the Common Era. A long, slow process of political and economic transformation across the Western Mediterranean world, as Roman authority weakened across many of the regions that had once maintained the Amber Road's carefully connected infrastructure. The organized, large-scale trade networks that had carried amber so efficiently during the height of the empire gradually became less consistent, less centrally coordinated, and in many areas reverted closer to the more informal, gradual patterns of exchange that had characterized the earliest centuries of amber trading, many hundreds of years before Rome had ever risen to prominence at all. This does not mean that amber trade disappeared entirely, however, and it is worth resting here for a moment to appreciate the quiet resilience of this particular material and the roots long associated with it. Amber continued to be gathered along the Baltic coastline, exactly as it always had been, since the geological processes that produced it were, of course, entirely unaffected by the political changes taking place many hundreds of kilometers to the south. And amber continued, in various forms and along various paths, to make its way toward other parts of Europe, carried now by different peoples, through different arrangements, as the political landscape of the continent shifted and reorganized itself across the centuries following Rome's decline in the West. Centuries later, during the medieval period, a new chapter in amber's long history began to take shape, centered once again quite closely around its original Baltic source, beginning particularly in the 13th century. A religious and military order known as the Teutonic Knights established significant control over portions of the Baltic coastline, including key amber-producing areas, and they developed a highly organized, closely regulated system for gathering, processing, and trading amber. One that in some ways echoed the more formal, structured trade patterns we saw during the height of Roman influence many centuries earlier. Under this system, amber gathering became a strictly controlled activity, with local communities required to hand over amber they collected to representatives of the order, who then oversaw its distribution to skilled craftspeople, and from there into wider European trade networks, including the increasingly important trading cities associated with the later medieval Hanseatic League, a powerful network of merchant guilds and market towns spanning much of northern Europe. This medieval period saw amber crafted into an impressively wide range of new forms, including elaborate rosaries, religious objects, and increasingly intricate decorative items, produced by skilled guild craftspeople in cities such as Gdansk, along the Baltic coast, which grew into a particularly important center for amber working during this era, in some ways echoing the earlier importance of Aquileia many centuries before, though shaped now by a very different set of cultural and religious traditions as centuries continued to pass, moving us gradually closer to more familiar modern history. Amber's popularity and significance continued to shift and evolve, moving in and out of particular fashions, valued differently by different generations, yet never entirely disappearing from human interest and appreciation. By the 18th century, amber had become closely associated with one of the most famous, and in later history, most mysterious artistic creations connected to this material: the amber room, an entire chamber whose walls were elaborately decorated with panels of amber. Originally created for the Prussian royal family before being gifted to Russia, where it was later installed within a grand imperial palace. The amber room's later history, including its disappearance during the upheaval of the Second World War, is itself a significant and often told story, though one that extends somewhat beyond the calmer, more ancient focus of our own journey together this evening, and is perhaps a story better suited to into a future night's quiet exploration of its own. For tonight, it is enough simply to note that Amber's remarkable journey, beginning in an ancient forest many millions of years before any human eye ever saw it, continued to hold meaning, value, and artistic significance across an extraordinary span of human history. From the earliest hunter-gatherers walking a cold northern shoreline, through Bronze Age traders following winding rivers, through Etruscan artisans and Roman emperors, and onward into the more recent centuries that connect, gradually and continuously, all the way to our own time. Today, amber continues to be gathered along much of the same Baltic coastline where our journey began, and museums across Europe, including collections in the regions we have traveled through together tonight, from the Baltic states through Central Europe and into Italy and Greece, preserve and display amber objects spanning this entire vast stretch of human history, allowing us, even now, to hold, in a sense, a very small, quiet piece of that ancient, patient story. As we bring our journey to a gentle close for tonight, it is worth simply sitting for a moment with everything we have quietly traveled through together. An ancient forest, warm and humid, quietly producing resin many millions of years before there was anyone present to notice. A cold, patient sea, gradually revealing small golden treasures along its shifting shoreline. Countless small, ordinary exchanges between people whose names have long since been forgotten, slowly weaving together an entire continent, river by river, valley by valley, mountain pass by mountain pass. Skilled hands in Etruscan and Roman workshops, carefully shaping ancient sunlight into lasting forms of beauty. Old stories of grieving sisters and falling tears, offered gently by people trying to make sense of something they could not otherwise explain, and quietly continuing even now along the same patient northern shoreline where we began this evening. The slow, steady rhythm of tide and time, still occasionally revealing small pieces of that same ancient forest, waiting patiently, as they always have, to be found. There is nothing more for you to follow tonight. The road we have traveled together across so many centuries and so much distance has, for now, reached its quiet end. Let your breathing settle fully now, slow and even, and let any remaining thoughts simply drift, gently, the way amber once drifted along ancient rivers, unhurried, patient, and entirely at ease. Rest well, sleep if you are ready, and know that this ancient, quiet story will be here again, whenever you next wish to return to it.